Hello, welcome back to Going Walkabout. Today I'll show you how I test my Firestore security rules. Going Walkabout is an iOS travel diary and it is using Firestore as a backend database. Now I assume you're familiar with Firestore and you also know that you need security rules to protect your data. And that's what I did as well. In 2019, when I started the project, I set up the data store, I defined my security rules, and I actually implemented some unit tests on that. But time has passed, and the unit testing you did back in 2019 is not usable in 2023 anymore. So I was running into an issue where I changed the logic of authenticated users. I wanted to give the public, so non-authenticated users, more access to certain parts of the data, and I needed to adjust my security rules. So I did that, but I also wanted to test them. And this episode is about how I use my testing, or how I did my testing of the security rules. So let's dive into it a little bit and show you what I've done and how I made a very simple, let's say, a piece of code to do the testing. First, here we see my security rules. Now, it's not excessive what I have in security rules, but just give you an idea. I have some helper functions to determine if your trip is public, trip is owner, whether you to get the follower data, because I have fairly complicated business logic. So you can see a trip if you own the trip or if you follow the trip. And in the future, it might even become a collaborator and it's even getting more complex. But that means I have some helper functions here. Then I have users in my system. And users are, well, the authenticated users. You can deal with your own stuff, like updating your user, but not with someone else. Just a very simple scenario to deal with that. And a user has notifications. And again, notifications are generated by the system, but you can read them, you can delete them, but you cannot delete it from someone else. Now, the more complicated logic happens here with my trips. I have trips, you own a trip, or you don't own a trip. Yeah, that's what's in the top section. A trip has posts that you can see, edit, manipulate. A trip also has followers, and for the followers it's even more complicated because someone else can add themselves as a follower of your trip, just to make sure that there is some logic in there. And a follower can then also see posts in that particular trip. And there's invites, and invites are created by a user, by a trip owner. I can invite you to follow my trip. So at that case, you need to be able to see the trip before you're actually following it, and makes things fairly complicated to deal with that, but it's all there. Now, you can flag trips, but we'll ignore that for now. And there's some about the followers, generic rules, because I also use the followers to find all the trips that I'm involved with or a user is involved with. So these are my security rules. And if I go to the security rules, I need to test them. So what I did is I created a very simple test script. Now, just to recap a little bit, this is my whole project. The project consists about some app engine on the back end, because I do also have some real backend logic that I could not do directly talking to Firestore. I have Firebase with Firebase functions. I use excessively database functions and storage on events in the data store. And I have some tests, and well, that's it. I have a front-end website, but it's not relevant for the project because it's just some admin tools. But this is the whole project, and inside there I have my my tests for my rules, and I have that in my test file here. I try to keep it very simple, but because I was already having a backend that is written in TypeScript, or maybe JavaScript, I have a front end in TypeScript, JavaScript, or a mix of that. So I also did that for my tests. And what I did for my test is I just took the rules unit testing from Firestore, Firebase. It's very simple. And I had tests in 2019, but I deleted them all because they were not relevant anymore, because at that time there was no Firestore emulator that you can use to test against, and there was just some kind of test bed to use the rules, so I had to scrap that, and I just started from scratch, and everything you see here is new. Now, what is important, I have a project ID. You can take anything, but I just have this one, and I actually created users. So I have a user, that's my user with my user data, and I have their user, because I always need to look at my security rules from two perspectives. From the perspective of the owner of something, the authenticated me, and the other one that I need to get access to. I have my security rules. Now, before everything, I initialize my test environment with the project ID. I read my rules. I do that on the local host because I am running everything locally against the emulator that I'll get into in a minute. I clear my data store, so I'm sure that I have an empty scenario to get started with. And I create my initial users. So, and this is the thing. If you want to create something, your security rules are applied. But that means that you cannot create test data. So in order to create some test data that you need to check your rules, you need to be able to create stuff with your security rules disabled. That's what I do here. So I just create my two initial users. So I have two users in the system. And those two users in the system are important because then I can test against them. And then for every test, I get my user. That's the me user, that's the one that I usually use as the authenticated context. There's the their user, that's an authenticated user, but it's not me. So I can check if I can see their trips, for instance. And there's a no user, what is actually a public user, because I also have the scenario where you have no user because you're just a public and you want to view something. And after everything, I clean up everything. Now, this is all I did to set up. And in your scenario, you might need to create some more initial data or not. But typically, you don't need to create that much initial data because the fire security rules, it's not filtering on your data. It's just looking what are the parameters that come into with your query. So what do you supply from your code to be applicable for the security rules, and based on that it will evaluate your rule. So you don't need actually data. It's not checking on that. Now let's go to my users. I say public user cannot read any data, and this is just I go into a user, and if the no user gets the user and it gets my user, it will get an assert fail. So the public cannot read a user. So I use the no user as the context, get their Firestore, get then the collection of users with the document of my ID is another user, and that should fail. But the same rule applies that an authenticated user, so the my user, and I created that in the beginning, they read the user for my ID, then it should be successful. And this is how I implement my rules. And I really try to do it as follows, that I write down my rules, I implement the rule, I implement the test, and then I actually write the security rule. Because it's much more clear to write down your scenarios in your test, so you have also documented what you can do and what you can do. Let's go a little bit further, because this is still very simple. Notifications. Notifications, for instance, public user cannot read any notifications. Now, I take the public user, no user, it gets the collection of users inside for me, so it goes to my user, and inside it gets my notifications. That will fail. But now if I do the same thing, the my user with the my ID, the notification, it will be successful. And here you can see that I do not need to create any data. I can just get actually the statement to collect the data, but I don't have notifications in my testing database because it doesn't need it to evaluate that. Now, it goes on, this is simple. Here, an out user can update their own. Now, because I'm going to update of an existing record, I need some data. So the first thing I do here is on my test environment with no security rules available, because I need to create something that would fail with my security rules, but I still need test data. And I say, okay, get my collection of users for me, so my user. I take the notification, I create a document test, and I set the message yes. Not relevant what it is, because I just need to retrieve it. And now I'm going to create on the my user context, so me, I get my users, my ID, my collection test, and it will succeed if I try to update that, because I can update that particular user. I created the document with test, I retrieve it here, and here I update it, that was successful. But the old user cannot update other notifications, same thing. I create again a record in my user collection, with their ID, notification test, message yes. And now if I try to get that, it will fail, because it's a different document ID for a different user with a different thing. And this is how I write down my security text. Now, if it gets a little bit more complicated, let's go into a particularly complicated scenario. Let's say an authenticated user can read the trip you're following. So I'm a user of the system, I'm authenticated, and I'm following a trip from someone else. So what do I need to do? I first need to create in the context a trip with a document, that's a trip following, and I set the name trip following. So I'm actually creating a trip here that is called trip following with the trip following ID. The document IDs do not really matter because I use different names throughout my test. And I create that trip as a name with the user of their user. So what I have actually created, I am myself using the my user as the context to check this from. So I created a trip owned by someone else. That's what I did here. Now I need to add to that particular collection. So to that trip, I need to add to the collection followers, my ID. So I am following that trip created for the other one with the role as a follower. And this, I need two records. I need the trip, I need the record to follow the trip, and then I can check my security rules. And now I go and my user can check the collection trips, trip following, and it will get a successful because I am following someone else's trip. But the same thing is that if I cannot read other trips, so I cannot just read a trip from someone else. So if I try to do that, it will fail. And this is how I build up my whole security rules. And inside the security rule, so let's go to this authenticated user can read the following trip. It actually gets to my rules. And let me find the rule. It is the trip pose, so it can read the trip. So if it's a shared trip, meaning it's a public trip, I can read it. That's simple. I also have a test for that any user can use a public trip. Or you own the trip. Then you can list all the trips. But it's not about listing the trip, because this rule is not listing, it is actually here read or get the trip, because this is getting a trip. So it's not listing trips. You can list public trips. That's what this rule says on the list. If it's public or you own it, so you can list your own or the public ones, nothing else. But it's doing a get. Now, and the get is taking, is the public? It's just a helper function that I showed you here. Is the trip public? It gets the trip data, and then shared is true. So it will check if it's a public trip here, or it will look if the resource, so the user is authenticated, or it's a follower. So the resource of the data, the user, is the owner of the trip, so you can read your own trip. Simple, because it's your trip, or is a trip follower. And the trip follower is again a helper function that takes in the trip. And what does that do? It goes into the trip follower, is trip follower, and it will do an exists on the trip ID and the user that is requesting it. Now, this is the user that is logged into the system, is requesting to get the data, and I can check if there's a record, and that is the way the data structure works. You have a trip, and the trip has a followers collection. So for the trip ID that I want to view, if there is a record in the trip collection for that particular user, yeah, that is authenticated, yes, you're our follower. And if I go to my collaborators, it will go a little bit more complicated, because it will not only have to look at that the record exists, but also that you're a follower. But if you're currently, the record exists, you are a follower, and it works. And this is how I build it up. Now, this is an explanation of the code. Let's go and have a run it. I have two terminals here. And one terminal is the emulator, so I can just go here and run my emulator. And this is important. I did a full video long time ago on the emulator. I use it a lot for local development. But since I use excessively the database triggers, and I only run for this particular test the Firestore and not my triggers, because otherwise, during my tests, it will trigger all these events, and it creates data, and it will fail on that. So I use my emulator only Firestore, because my only purpose here is to test my security rules. So I run this, and it will start the emulator, and it will say it's running the emulator. And then in a second terminal, I typically just run my test, because that's what I put in my script. It's going to run the test. And it gives me quite a bit of warnings, but those warnings you can ignore, because they're actually warning that my Firebase security rule doesn't match. And if I go through, it says here, now let's look at the one that I said I had my old user that can read. An old user can read following trips. Yes, it's all checked. And the end result is here in the end that I've passed all my trips. And by first writing my test, then implementing my rules, and continuously test everything at the same time, it's very quickly to define them and refine them the way you want. So once I start my project where I want to involve collaborators, I first start adding new tests here, that you not only are a follower or a trip or a collaborator is actually a follower. So in that scenario, I don't need to check it. But in case of updating the trip or writing a post, especially when you add a post, yeah, if you're a collaborator, you can do that. I have those, can create a trip, can update the trip, and I have post. See, old user cannot delete a post. Well, I can create a post in their own trip. See, I can not create a post in someone else's trip. And here I need to add a rule that a collaborator can post in a trip not owned, but you're the collaborator. I write more tests. Then I run my security test. It will fail, because very likely there is, well, if I did my work right, that test will fail, and I can create and change my security rules, but rerun all my tests to make sure that all the other things are still working. And for me, it's extremely helpful to do that. Took me some time to really get into it and to try to understand the security rules, that it is not so much about the data, but much more about the data you pass in from your client in order to evaluate the rule. And it was very helpful for me to, at a certain point, also distinguish here between the list and the get. Because initially, I tried to do everything on the list or on the read, because the read is actually a list or a get. But I got stuck in that part here with my followers. And once I realized you need to get the trip before you can get the post. And it gets even more complicated, because here, for instance, can I read the post? Yeah, if you're the trip follower on the trip, I needed to implement that. And I actually, when I had implemented the way that the public could see my application, well, you can go view videos back about that, I was running a lot of errors, and I suddenly had to make my rules more relaxed, because initially only authenticated users could log in. So I needed to go through that and do those tests to make sure, before I publish anything into a production, that it is secure. Now, this is my way how I test my rules. I maintain this. I'm very happy with this approach. It allows me to very quickly go through and add new rules and change them and tweak them, and to make sure that the application is safe. So, one file does it all. simple test runner with Jest in my scenario, but you probably have your preferred test runner is doing about the same. It works, and yeah, it's something that was very beneficial for me to put some time in to make sure it works. I hope you liked it, I hope it's useful for you, and I'll thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.